Everyone at the auction house called him the machine. No emotion, no mistakes, no past. Sofia had heard the warnings before her first day. What no one told her was that the machine had spent years secretly buying back everything her father had lost. Sofia stepped into the grand auction hall, her heels clicking lightly against the polished wooden floor. The room was enormous, with high ceilings and towering windows that let in the last golden rays of the afternoon. Shadows stretched across the ornate walls, giving the impression that centuries of history were quietly observing every move made within these walls. The air smelled of old varnish, faintly musty but elegant, with hints of fresh paint and polished wood lingering where the rare pieces rested on their pedestals. She could feel the tension, almost tangible, vibrating like the quiet hum before a storm. Collectors and bidders murmured to each other in low voices, each with their own strategy, their own ambitions, their own silent stakes. Sofia didn't belong here, at least not yet. This hall held more than just art for her. It held the ghost of her father's legacy. 10 years ago, his reputation had vanished along with their family collection, leaving Sofia with nothing but a sharp eye and a burning need to understand how a lifetime of history could be dismantled so coldly. Every step she took was measured, controlled, because she knew that this moment, fleeting as it might be, could decide everything. Her chest tightened slightly, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to steady her nerves. This was her last chance, the one interview that might pull her from obscurity into the world she had dreamed about for years. Her gaze drifted toward the centerpiece of the auction, a rare landscape painting, its brushwork delicate, almost whispering secrets of a past long gone. Golds and deep greens swirled in patterns that suggested movement, life, even if the scene was frozen in oil. Everyone else's eyes were drawn to it, murmuring approval or strategizing bids. But Sofia's attention wasn't on the painting's beauty, it was on its integrity. She stepped closer, studying the surface, the texture, the almost imperceptible brushstrokes. Her fingers hovered near the edge, careful not to touch, tracing the contours with the practiced eye of someone who had spent countless hours identifying imperfections invisible to the untrained observer. And there it was, a hairline crack, so fine it seemed impossible to see unless you were looking for it. Everyone else had missed it. The experts, the other bidders, even the gallery staff. All had overlooked what she saw in a heartbeat. She felt a flicker of recognition from across the room. Sebastian. He was tall, impossibly composed, and stood with his shoulders squared, his sharp eyes sweeping the crowd with cold precision. There was a stillness to him, a disciplined control that felt almost intimidating, bordering on ruthless. Sofia had heard stories about men like him. Calculating, relentless, feared in professional circles, known for the icy perfection of their judgment. And yet, in that brief moment, as their eyes met across the space crowded with anticipation, there was something else, a silent assessment, a recognition that her perception mattered. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply noted. The auctioneer's voice cut through the low hum of the room, announcing the opening bids. Sofia tried to focus on the sounds of the gavel and the murmurs of offers, but her mind kept returning to the crack, to the subtle imperfection that could define her career. She reminded herself to remain calm, to not let her excitement show, even as her heart pounded with adrenaline. Each participant in the hall moved with purpose, yet it was Sofia's quiet, unnoticed observation that would set her apart. As the bids climbed, she sensed Sebastian's attention linger momentarily on her again. A flicker in his otherwise controlled demeanor, almost imperceptible, but undeniable to her trained eye. It was acknowledgement, recognition, but also calculation. He was weighing her presence, measuring her acuity, seeing if she could endure, if she belonged. She held her ground, her gaze steady, aware that this small moment, her noticing, her understanding of what others could not see, might tip the scales. When the gavel finally came down, signaling the final bid, there was a ripple of applause, polite and restrained. But Sofia didn't turn her attention to the sale. Her focus was inward, registering the subtle weight of what had occurred. Sebastian didn't approach her, didn't speak a word. Yet in the quiet glance he cast, she felt a bridge forming between their professional worlds. It was silent, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Her expertise, her sharp observation, had spoken for her louder than any words could. Later, after the hall emptied and the lights dimmed, Sofia walked slowly toward the exit, the echo of her heels mingling with the fading murmurs of excitement. She felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation, knowing that the simple act of noticing something others had ignored had changed everything. She had passed the unspoken test. Sebastian's cold, calculating presence had not intimidated her. Instead, it had acknowledged her worth in a way that words could not. She realized, with a quiet pulse of triumph, that she had taken her first real step into the world she had long desired, and that the path ahead, uncertain as it was, had already begun to shift in her favor. Sofia's first week at the firm was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The office itself was sleek, almost sterile, with glass walls that reflected every movement, every gesture, making privacy nearly impossible. The clatter of keyboards, the faint hum of computers, and the subtle scraping of chair legs against the polished floors formed a rhythm she had to learn quickly. Sebastian's presence was a silent weight in the room. He never looked at the keys when he typed, and his instructions arrived on Sofia's desk with the regularity of a metronome, clipped, single-sentence directives that left no room for a second draft. Sofia found herself deciphering not just his orders, but the nuances between the lines, the intentions hidden in his brevity. It was a language of discipline she had never encountered. She tried to approach him directly, asking questions, seeking guidance, but Sebastian had a way of redirecting without condescension, his notes sharp yet neutral, his gestures minimal. There was no anger, no warmth, only the unbroken rhythm of efficiency. He had earned the nickname, the Machine, for a reason. Colleagues whispered about it in hushed tones, recounting stories of tense auctions where Sebastian remained immovable even in moments of potential disaster. Sofia felt the weight of his reputation pressing against her confidence, yet she also sensed that every challenge was an opportunity. She began taking meticulous notes, studying his habits, the patterns of his movements, the timing of his instructions. Every small observation became a tool, a way to navigate the rigid structure he had created. The contrast between the bustling office and Sebastian's unflinching composure fascinated her. While others reacted to stress with raised voices or abrupt movements, he remained unshaken, almost serene in the face of potential failure. Meetings were conducted with precision, each agenda item crossed off with clinical accuracy. Emails were brief, almost mechanical, directives concise, leaving no room for ambiguity. Yet behind the glass walls, Sofia sensed the tension in the controlled air, the pressure of expectations that hovered over every desk. She noticed how colleagues avoided unnecessary questions, how every interaction with Sebastian required preparation and forethought. It was a world where mistakes were noted silently, consequences measured meticulously, and excellence was the only acceptable outcome. Once, she misidentified a 19th-century restoration as original pigment in a minor catalog entry. Sebastian didn't scold her. He simply circled the error in red ink and left a 3-word note on her desk. "Look closer, Sofia." She spent the next 4 hours in the archives, re-examining every inch of the canvas until her eyes burned, realizing he wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for the moment she would stop assuming she was right. Despite the intensity, Sofia discovered small cracks in the armor. A slight hesitation in his hand when reviewing an unusually complex catalog entry, a fleeting furrow in his brow when confronted with contradictory valuations. These were moments that revealed the human beneath the machine. She observed quietly, understanding that patience was essential. Any misstep on her part could be magnified under his scrutiny, but any insight could earn a rare acknowledgement. Her role was not just to follow instructions, but to anticipate needs, to learn the rhythm of his mind. Every day became a test of adaptability, observation, and discretion. By the end of the first week, Sofia had begun to internalize the strict code of the office. She moved with purpose, aware that every glance, every movement, was part of a silent dialogue with Sebastian. He remained distant, yet in subtle ways, he allowed her presence to be noted. An approving nod of her catalog entries, a brief look of acknowledgement when she completed a task with precision. It was a careful balance of distance and recognition, one that demanded both respect and strategic patience. The glass walls that divided the office were more than physical barriers. They symbolized the threshold Sofia had to cross to earn not just trust, but understanding. And in those reflective, almost oppressive corridors, she began to see Sebastian not just as the untouchable, unemotional figure everyone feared, but as someone shaped by discipline, by past failures and successes, by the need to control what was otherwise uncontrollable. Each day brought new challenges, subtle tests of skill and endurance, and Sofia realized that to succeed here, she had to become attuned not just to tasks, but to the invisible language of precision and restraint that governed every corner of this carefully measured world. She was no longer merely an observer. She was part of the system, learning its rhythms, anticipating its demands, and slowly carving a space for herself within the cold but exacting environment Sebastian had constructed. The project had arrived sooner than Sofia expected. An entire evening stretched ahead of them in the dimly lit archives, where the air smelled of dust, old paper, and fading varnish. Sebastian moved with the same meticulous precision he displayed in the office, his hands gliding over catalog entries, his eyes scanning documents for errors, inconsistencies, anything that threatened the integrity of the auction they were preparing. He spoke rarely, almost never, except through the notes he left beside each record or the occasional low, controlled instruction. Yet tonight, the absence of others, the silence of the archive, the isolation from prying eyes, made something shift. Sofia carefully opened a heavy folio, revealing letters and ledgers dating back decades. Candlelight and the soft glow of the overhead lamp highlighted the faded ink, the delicate edges of papers brittle with age. She glanced up at Sebastian, who was examining a particularly ornate catalog entry, his brow slightly furrowed, as if the numbers themselves demanded discipline. For a brief moment, he looked up from his work and allowed a question to pass his lips, a question not about valuations, but about a historical detail in a letter, the provenance of a painting, the context of an acquisition. His voice was low, almost foreign to her ears, as though he were testing not just her knowledge, but her passion. She answered, carefully precise, weaving facts and interpretation together, and saw a flicker of something she had never expected: interest. Hours passed with the slow rhythm of cataloging, numbering, and cross-referencing. The archive smelled of old leather bindings and ink. The faint chill of the basement seeped through their clothing, yet Sofia remained absorbed. And in that quiet, confined space, Sebastian spoke again, this time about art, about the way a brushstroke could reveal the intent of its creator, the subtlety of light and shadow, the narrative hidden in pigment. His voice was steady, still controlled, but it carried a rare warmth, a curiosity that went beyond the mechanical precision he exhibited in the office. Sofia realized she was hearing something few had ever heard: the man behind the machine, glimpsed only through his reverence for art and history. She noticed the small details he allowed her to see, how he lingered on a page longer than necessary, tracing a line with his finger before returning it to its folder, how he occasionally tilted his head as if imagining the scene described in a century-old letter. These moments were fleeting, subtle, but they revealed the depth of someone who had carefully cultivated control to guard his inner world. Sofia felt a cautious respect growing, mingled with the tiniest spark of connection. They were alone, yet working in tandem, their minds aligned by the silent rhythm of the project. No interruptions, no external distractions, only the weight of history and the task before them. At one point, a faint gust of wind from the small, high window stirred a stack of documents. Sofia reached to steady them, and their hands brushed briefly over the worn parchment. Neither spoke. The contact was insignificant in itself, yet in the silence of the archive, it carried an unspoken acknowledgement of presence, a recognition that they were navigating the same labyrinth of duty and expectation. The work demanded collaboration, and collaboration demanded trust, even if unspoken. It was an illogical move for a man built on isolation, but Sebastian sensed in Sofia the same obsessive devotion to truth that had once burned his own bridges. He was gambling, but it was the only way to see if she could truly handle the weight of real responsibility. Before leaving for the evening, Sebastian had handed her a heavy, brass-bound key to the private vault, a silent gesture of absolute clearance that allowed her to cross the final threshold of his professional defenses. As the night deepened and the lamp cast long shadows along the rows of shelves, Sophia realized that she was learning more than the catalog itself. She was learning how to read Sebastian, to anticipate his needs, to understand the patterns behind his cold precision. And in turn, Sebastian was revealing fragments of himself, fragments that were subtle but unmistakable, a historian's passion, a meticulous mind, a fleeting curiosity about human perception and history. By the time they closed the final ledger and packed the documents carefully back into their folders, the air between them had shifted imperceptibly. What began as a professional obligation had become a shared endeavor, a silent communion of minds drawn together by their respect for art, for accuracy, and, unknowingly, for each other. The archive felt heavier that evening, as though the walls themselves were aware of what was about to unfold. Sophia was organizing a collection of letters when she noticed Sebastian frozen over a particular document. His hands, usually steady and decisive, trembled ever so slightly. His sharp, unyielding gaze faltered as he read a letter yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible. There was a subtle quiver in his jaw, a rapid, almost imperceptible intake of breath. Sophia knew, instinctively, that something had struck a chord deep within him, something that wasn't part of the controlled, calculated facade he maintained. She felt a jolt of awareness. This was the human behind the machine, and he was vulnerable. She didn't speak. Words might have shattered the fragile veil of his composure or worse, imposed judgment. Instead, she moved closer, sitting silently beside him, close enough to offer presence but distant enough to respect the space he seemed to demand. Minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers and the faint scratch of pen on ledger sheets. Her heart thumped, each beat synchronized with the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest. In that quiet, she offered the only support she knew, companionship without intrusion, acknowledgement without interrogation. Sebastian's eyes flickered toward her briefly, and in that glance, Sophia saw the battle within him. Pain, regret, and perhaps remnants of old grief flickered behind the mask of control. He swallowed hard, straightened his posture, and returned to the document as if nothing had happened, yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed the effort it required to reclaim his usual composure. Sophia understood that this was a turning point. She didn't need to ask what haunted him. Her presence, steady and non-judgmental, was enough to bridge the first fragment of trust. Hours passed, and they continued to work through the catalog, yet the atmosphere had shifted. Sebastian was still precise, still disciplined, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in the way he allowed her input, a rare patience when she pointed out cross-references or historical inconsistencies. For the first time, he seemed to tolerate more than mere correctness. He seemed to recognize the value of collaboration, of a mind attentive enough to notice what even he might overlook in the tide of work. Sophia, in turn, felt a deepened sense of responsibility and respect. She realized that her role now went beyond clerical assistance. She was part of a delicate process, navigating not only the history of art, but also the intricate human boundaries of a man whose trust had never been easily given. The air was still heavy with dust and candlelight as they finally began to close the ledgers for the night. Sebastian remained silent, his movements precise, yet there was a softness in the way he arranged the documents, a subtle relaxation in his posture. Sophia felt it too, the weight of unspoken words, the quiet understanding that this shared silence had cemented a bond. In the stark contrast to the controlled environment of the office, the isolation of the archive had revealed something essential. Vulnerability could coexist with discipline, and trust could begin without a single word spoken. As they left the archive, Sophia sensed the lingering tension, the invisible trace of the night's revelation. Sebastian walked ahead, still reserved, still a machine in the eyes of the world, but she knew better now. She had glimpsed the fracture in the armor, the human truth beneath the calculated exterior, and with that knowledge came a subtle shift in their relationship. Something unspoken had passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement that would shape the hours, the days, and the inevitable challenges to come. The office felt different that morning, a tension heavier than usual settled in the air. Sebastian moved through the glass-walled corridors with his usual precision, yet there was a subtle stiffness, a barely perceptible vigilance in his posture. Sofia noticed it immediately, the way his eyes flicked toward the entrance more often, the way his hand hesitated over the catalog before setting it down. She didn't speak. She had learned to read these signs. Something or someone was coming. The door opened quietly, and in stepped Julian. He was polished, confident, his presence commanding in a way that seemed almost at odds with the formal, calculated atmosphere of Sebastian's domain. Julian's eyes swept the room, lingering on Sofia longer than necessary. He spoke in a calm, almost casual tone, presenting a business proposal, but the undertone was unmistakable: provocation, a reminder of past transgressions, a subtle attempt to unbalance Sebastian. Sebastian's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around a pen as he considered the paper Julian handed him. There was a flicker of old familiarity, a shadow of history between them that Sofia could sense even without knowing the details. Julian's gaze returned to her briefly, an almost imperceptible smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He had noticed the dynamic between Sebastian and his assistant, the careful attentions, the unspoken trust that had begun to form. Sofia's pulse quickened. She had anticipated scrutiny in her new role, but not this, an intrusion that was personal, probing, and loaded with hidden motives. Her instincts sharpened immediately, cataloging not only Julian's words but his gestures, his timing, the subtle power he tried to exert. Sebastian remained still, composed as ever, yet Sofia could feel the tension under the surface, a controlled storm. Every movement was deliberate, every response measured. He allowed Julian to speak, nodded minimally, and asked pointed questions that revealed knowledge and strategy, never emotion. Julian, however, pushed gently, reminding him of shared past ventures, of mistakes that had been made together, and of obligations long buried. Sebastian's expression didn't change, yet his eyes darkened subtly, betraying the careful restraint he maintained. Sofia, positioned quietly at her desk, absorbed every nuance. She recognized the careful balance of power, the intricate dance of past betrayals and present control. Julian was not here for business alone. He was testing, probing for weaknesses, seeking leverage. She had to remain composed, her reactions measured, her presence neutral yet observant. She made small notes, mentally recording each inflection, each pause, the subtle way Sebastian responded. She realized that she was now not just a witness, but a participant in a silent chess match, where one wrong move could tilt the board entirely. Minutes stretched into an hour. Julian finally took his leave, leaving behind the echo of unresolved tension and a subtle sense of threat. Sebastian remained seated, the corners of his mouth tight, his gaze distant as if he were recalibrating the boundaries of control. Sofia approached cautiously, offering a quiet acknowledgement, a steady presence without intrusion. Sebastian glanced at her, and for a moment, the rigid machine softened slightly. No words were spoken, yet the shared understanding was clear. The past had returned, it had left its mark, and the strength of their unspoken alliance would be tested in the days to come. As the office lights dimmed and the glass walls reflected their quiet determination, Sofia understood something vital. Julian's presence was not merely an obstacle. It was a mirror of trust and vigilance, a challenge that would demand the full measure of their combined skill and restraint. And somewhere beneath the cold exterior, she sensed Sebastian acknowledging this truth, the faintest recognition that she was no longer just an assistant, but a steady ally in navigating both history and hazard. The sky over London had darkened by the time they left the office, heavy clouds pressing down as if the city itself were holding its breath. Sebastian's car moved steadily through the slick streets, windshield wipers cutting rhythmic arcs through the downpour. Sofia watched the rain streak past the glass, listening to the soft roar of tires on wet asphalt, feeling a tension that had nothing to do with the storm outside. For the first time, she was accompanying him beyond the controlled environment of the office, beyond the glass walls and silent corridors. The air between them was tentative, charged with unspoken questions and cautious curiosity. They arrived at the countryside estate just as the rain intensified, turning the drive into a slow crawl along mud-slicked lanes. The grand house loomed ahead, shrouded in mist and shadow, its stone walls darkened by the persistent drizzle. The private car service that was supposed to collect them had been canceled due to flooded routes, forcing them to wait for a local off-road vehicle that could navigate the mud-slicked lanes. Sebastian's posture remained rigid, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his folder, yet the occasional glance towards Sofia suggested a growing awareness of her presence, her reliability, her steadiness. Inside the estate, the rain continued to lash against the windows, and the warm glow of the fireplace in the small guest room offered a stark contrast to the storm outside. Sebastian pored over the antique pieces they had come to evaluate, cataloging them with meticulous care, yet there was a noticeable softness in his movements. The hours of uninterrupted focus allowed him to speak more freely, his voice low but calm, sharing observations about the artistry, the provenance, and the subtle histories embedded in each piece. Sofia listened intently, absorbing both the details and the rare glimpses of humanity behind his disciplined exterior. When a lull fell over their work, Sofia dared to ask a tentative question about the source of his cold demeanor, the precision that had earned him the nickname, the Machine. Sebastian didn't offer the story easily. It came in jagged fragments. He spoke of a betrayal not of money, but of trust. A partner who had sold out a legacy for a quick profit, leaving Sebastian to rebuild from the ashes with a heart turned to stone. It wasn't a confession, but a warning. In this world, precision was the only armor that didn't break. Sofia remained silent, offering only the steady presence of listening ears and understanding eyes, the warmth of her attentiveness a counterpoint to the storm outside. For a long moment, Sebastian stared into the flames, his jaw set so tight it looked carved from stone. He seemed on the verge of retreating back behind his glass walls, his habitual silence almost winning. But then, without looking at her, he exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "Precision is not a choice for me, Sofia," he added, his voice barely a whisper against the crackle of the fire. "It's a necessity when you've seen how easily a single, careless lie can dismantle a century of truth. I knew who you were the moment you walked into that auction hall," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the fire. "But I couldn't tell you. I needed to know if you had inherited your father's integrity or just his eye for art. Trust, Sofia, is the only thing in this room that cannot be appraised or bought back once it's lost." Hours passed in this way, work interspersed with conversation that skated just at the edges of personal revelation. Sebastian, while still disciplined, began to reveal patterns, preferences, and rare hints of humor, small cracks in the facade that allowed Sofia to see the man beneath. She recognized the weight of responsibility she carried, the delicate nature of the trust he had allowed her to glimpse. In turn, she felt a quiet bond forming, forged in shared focus, mutual respect, and the intimate isolation that the storm and the estate had provided. By the time they retired for the night, the rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle, the Thames-like streams along the estate's roads reflecting the faint glow of lamps and lanterns. Sofia understood something vital. Beyond the walls of the office, beyond the discipline and calculation, Sebastian was not invincible. He could be human, he could be vulnerable, and he could, under the right circumstances, allow connection. And in the quiet of the storm-lashed countryside, Sofia felt that she had crossed another threshold, not just in her role as his assistant, but in understanding the layers that made him who he was, and the care required to navigate both the man and the machine. The following morning arrived gray and oppressive, the drizzle from the previous night still clinging to the city streets. Sofia had returned to the office early, her mind preoccupied with the details of the estate evaluation and the rare moments of candor Sebastian had allowed during their stay. She was reviewing the catalog entries when the office door creaked open, and Julian appeared, leaning casually against the frame, his presence immediately commanding the room. There was a calculated charm in his smile, but his eyes carried the weight of menace, an unmistakable edge that set Sofia's nerves on alert. Without preamble, Julian handed her a thick folder, the edges of the papers crisp, the documents neatly stacked, almost clinical in their presentation. He spoke with that smooth, persuasive tone he wielded like a weapon, claiming he had information about Sebastian's past dealings, specifically regarding her father's collection. He insisted that Sebastian had deliberately bankrupted her family years ago to acquire their art at a fraction of its worth. "I've watched you, Sofia," Julian added, a sharp glint in his eyes. "You have your father's gift for seeing what's hidden. It's a shame you're wasting it serving the man who put him in the grave. I thought you'd prefer the truth over a paycheck." Sofia didn't flinch. Hours passed in a haze of scrutiny. Sofia went through each sheet, each ledger, each note Julian had provided, cross-referencing them with her own observations from previous projects and the conversations with Sebastian during their late-night work. The sense of betrayal grew alongside the gnawing uncertainty. Her mind replayed Sebastian's rare moments of vulnerability, the story of his personal betrayal, the quiet presence he had offered her in the archive, the candor beside the fireplace at the estate. And yet, the evidence Julian had left was compelling, methodical, and written with a clarity that made denial difficult. By mid-afternoon, Sofia's hands ached from holding the papers, her mind spinning with possibilities. She realized that trust was now a fragile construct, one misstep away from shattering completely. Sebastian, who had been oblivious to Julian's intrusion, remained immersed in his own meticulous work, unaware of the storm building within his assistant. The folder felt like lead in her hands. Sofia avoided Sebastian's gaze, her focus narrowing to the documents, though the words blurred as her mind raced to reconcile the silent man across the room with the monster described in Julian's files. The poisoned seed of doubt had taken root, silently undermining the foundation of their growing bond. She knew the professional code. A report should have been made immediately. But Sofia also knew that a machine only respects data, and she refused to bring him a problem without first finding the solution herself. As the day drew to a close, Sofia closed the folder, her thoughts heavy with questions she was not yet ready to voice. Julian's calculated interference had sown suspicion, a tension that would test both her judgment and her perception of Sebastian. She knew she could no longer approach their work with the same unquestioning trust. Every decision, every gesture, every note he wrote would now be filtered through the shadow of doubt. The seed had been planted, subtle but potent, and its growth promised to shape the next stages of their relationship in ways she could not yet predict. The office was colder than usual that morning, the glass walls reflecting not only light but the tension that had settled between them. Sofia moved through her tasks with mechanical precision, her eyes avoiding Sebastian's, her movements calculated to maintain distance. The folder Julian had given her still rested heavily in her mind, each page a reminder of the doubt that had taken root. She had not spoken of it, not yet, but the unease had begun to manifest subtly, in the curt replies to Sebastian's notes, in the deliberate delay of her usual prompt responses, in the absence of the warmth or curiosity that had accompanied her work before. Sebastian noticed immediately. His eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, scanning for cues, for signs that he could not quite name. His own demeanor shifted imperceptibly. The precision remained, the discipline intact, but there was a tautness in his shoulders, a restrained intensity in the set of his jaw. He could sense the wall she had erected, the coldness that mirrored his own guardedness, yet he did not yet know the source. Every note he left, every instruction he issued, carried the weight of both professional expectation and personal confusion. He was navigating a new tension, one that challenged his ability to control the environment around him, the environment that had always been so predictably governed by his own rules. Sofia's behavior unsettled him in a way that was unfamiliar. The office, usually a domain where he commanded unquestioned authority, now felt fragile, every interaction precarious. He attempted explanations, brief clarifications delivered with the same neutral tone he used for tasks, but they met with minimal acknowledgement. Each failed attempt deepened the silent rift, the space between them widening like a physical void. The unspoken conflict was heavier than any argument, more exhausting than any confrontation. It was a war waged in glances, in hesitation, in the careful avoidance of shared words. The day stretched on, punctuated by tasks that normally would have been routine, yet now seemed to highlight the distance between them. Sofia cataloged items with meticulous care, noting discrepancies in Julian's documents, correcting valuations where she could, but withholding both her observations and her emotions. Sebastian moved through the office with methodical grace, issuing instructions, verifying entries. Yet every action seemed shadowed by the absence of trust he could sense but could not articulate. Both operated as though on autopilot, each step deliberate, each gesture measured, both acutely aware of the tension but unwilling to breach the fragile boundary of silence. By late afternoon, the unspoken strain reached its peak. The air was charged, a subtle current of frustration and hurt running through every movement. Sofia's hands trembled slightly as she filed documents, her mind torn between loyalty and suspicion, between professional duty and personal emotion. Sebastian, observing from across the room, felt an unfamiliar sting, a vulnerability born not of exposure but of distance, of the unperceived fracture in their connection. For the first time, he realized that control alone could not bridge the growing chasm. Trust had to be restored, yet he lacked the clarity of the trigger that had created the divide. In that tense stillness, both of them operated on a fragile edge, each acutely aware of the other's presence, each constrained by a mixture of pride, fear, and the lingering influence of Julian's interference. The silent conflict hung over the office like a tangible weight, shaping every interaction, coloring every glance, and leaving both Sofia and Sebastian poised on the brink of a confrontation they were neither ready to have nor capable of ignoring for much longer. It was a test of patience, endurance, and perception, and neither could yet predict which of them would yield first, or if the delicate bond they had begun to forge would survive the poison sown so skillfully by an outside hand. The office archives were quiet that evening, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound accompanying Sofia as she meticulously sifted through old ledgers, invoices, and correspondence. Julian's folder had remained unopened on her desk until now, the weight of suspicion pressing on her chest like a stone. She had resolved to uncover the truth herself, to reconcile the man she had begun to trust with the evidence that threatened to dismantle that fragile connection. Each document she handled felt heavier than the last, carrying the potential to confirm betrayal or reveal salvation. Sofia worked systematically, her mind threading through dates, signatures, and transaction records, cross-referencing with the cataloged acquisitions Sebastian had overseen. Over the next few days, Sofia conducted a silent audit, cross-referencing Julian's evidence with the firm's internal digital free ledgers. The breakthrough came not from a single letter, but from a forensic trail Julian had overlooked. Sofia discovered that the initial bankruptcy filings, though dated 10 years ago, were processed through a shell company where Julian held a silent partnership. Sebastian hadn't even been in the country then. His signature only appeared 5 years later, when he began systematically buying back the family assets Julian had scattered. He wasn't the architect of her father's ruin. He was the one who had been quietly rebuilding the pieces, waiting for someone with a sharp enough eye to help him complete the puzzle. The evidence pointed not to Sebastian's greed, but to a long-term, calculated rescue mission that Julian was now desperate to frame as a crime. The revelation hit her in waves, each more profound than the last. Sebastian had not bankrupted her father's company to acquire the collection. He had intervened anonymously, settling debts and ensuring the family's survival while preserving their reputation. The signatures under questionable documents were Julian's, forged with precision to fabricate guilt. Sofia felt a surge of vindication, a simultaneous relief and sorrow for the doubt that had clouded her perception of Sebastian. She leaned back in her chair, the soft click of ledger covers closing punctuating her realization. The man she had begun to understand, the man who had silently guided her through the intricate world of art and history, was not the villain Julian had painted him to be. Her mind replayed the late nights in the archive, the quiet companionship, the stories of art, the shared silences in which trust had quietly grown. Every gesture Sebastian had made now resonated with a deeper authenticity. The meticulousness, the patience, the rare glimpses of vulnerability, all had been genuine. Julian's manipulation had been a shadow over a truth too long obscured, yet now clarity emerged in every line of historical record she examined. Sofia felt a renewed commitment, a determination to correct the narrative and defend not only Sebastian's reputation but the integrity of the work they had undertaken together. Closing the final ledger, Sofia understood the stakes had shifted. Trust, once fractured, now demanded affirmation, and she was determined to ensure it endured. The evidence in the archives was irrefutable. Julian's deception could be exposed, and Sebastian's name restored to its rightful place. She gathered the documents, her resolve firm, aware that the confrontation to come would be as much about principle as it was about vindication. Every detail she had painstakingly verified, every cross-reference and annotation, was now a weapon against falsehood and a testament to the painstaking care with which she and Sebastian had approached their shared work. As the evening shadows deepened across the office, Sofia felt a quiet confidence. The silent conflict that had weighed so heavily over the past days could finally be addressed, not with accusation or anger, but with the clarity of truth. The poison seed had been uprooted, replaced with the certainty of justice and integrity. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, unspoken anticipation stirred. The moment she would reveal this truth to Sebastian, to restore what had been nearly lost, and to see, perhaps for the first time, the man behind the machine smile without restraint. The auction hall was alive with muted anticipation, the soft murmur of conversation blending with the occasional clink of glasses and the distant shuffle of papers. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the assembled guests, highlighting the rare and priceless works on display. Sofia stood near the catalog desk, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Tonight was the culmination of months of preparation, but for her, it carried a weight beyond the meticulous organization of art. It was the night she would restore the truth and protect the man whose trust she had come to value above all else. Sebastian moved through the hall with his usual composed elegance, his sharp gaze scanning the crowd, noting both the obvious and subtle reactions to each piece. Yet tonight, there was a difference. He allowed himself fleeting glances at Sofia, brief acknowledgments that went unnoticed by others, as though silently seeking reassurance. The air between them, once heavy with suspicion and tension, now carried a quiet understanding. Sofia had discovered the truth, and while he did not yet know how much she knew, the bond forged through hours of work, shared silences, and moments of vulnerability remained intact. As the auction began, the first bids were called, echoing across the hall. Sofia monitored the proceedings, her mind alert for any sign of disruption, particularly from Julian, who had arrived, blending seamlessly into the audience. Her pulse quickened as she noticed him, his eyes calculating, but she held her ground, confident in the evidence she now possessed. Each item was presented with meticulous care, each bid recorded with precision, yet the underlying narrative was clear. This was more than a transaction. It was a test of character, of integrity, and of the culmination of all their shared efforts. When the time came to address the final, most valuable piece, Sofia didn't step into the spotlight. Instead, as Julian moved toward the front to finalize his presence, she intercepted both him and Sebastian in the quiet shadow of the viewing gallery. She didn't wait for the final gavel. As Julian moved toward the front, Sofia intercepted him, sliding a single, yellowed sheet from Sebastian's private archive over the catalog desk. This secret contract you planted as proof of Sebastian's guilt from 2013 has one fatal flaw, Julian, she whispered, her voice lethal in its calm. The watermark on this specific paper batch wasn't manufactured until the spring of 2016. You were so eager to fabricate the past that you forgot to check the physical foundation of your lie. I found the original paper factory invoices in the vault Sebastian gave me access to. Julian's confident smile didn't just falter. It vanished as he realized he had been lured into a trap. Sebastian stepped out from the shadows of the gallery, his expression unreadable but his presence towering. I've been holding those invoices for years, waiting for you to make a move, Sebastian added, his voice a low vibration. I just needed someone with an eye sharp enough to know exactly where that piece fit into your puzzle of forgeries. My legal team is waiting in the lobby. Without a word, Julian retreated, disappearing into the crowd before the scandal could break. Sebastian turned to Sofia, and for the first time, the machine allowed a genuine, unguarded look of respect to soften his features. I knew you'd find it, he said quietly. Thank you, Sofia. As they left the hall together, the silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a bridge. The machine hadn't broken. It had finally achieved perfect calibration, finding a partner whose gaze was sharp enough to see the light through the finest cracks in the oil paint and the human soul.